This is Rabbi Dr. Sid Vineburg, and today's podcast is going to be about our father Jacob, Yaakov. And with me, as always, is my very competent and intelligent assistant, Mr. E. Say hi, Mr. E.
Hi.
And eventually, Mr. E is going to be doing a podcast of his own. And so I hope that everybody will tune in for that. We'll give you some warning. Once again, I want to remind everybody 12 and up, please go and get your vaccine. It is terribly important. Let's destroy COVID. Let's be done with this thing. Take off our masks and go back to living our lives the way they were before COVID. So today we're going to talk about Jacob. And one of the things that I think that we believe, a mistake that we make, is that we think that just because someone has a connection, a kesher with God, they live charmed lives. Nothing bad is supposed to happen to people who have a special connection to God. Now, we know that Jacob had a very special connection to God. In fact, the children of Israel are called the children of Israel because of Jacob. Jacob's name, after his battle with the man or the angel in the book of Genesis, becomes Yisrael, he who wrestles with God. We'll talk more about that as we go on today. But Jacob is a perfect example of someone who did not really lead a charmed life. Jacob had all kinds of problems. Some of them were of his own making. First of all, let's go to his birth. Jacob was the younger twin of Isaac and Rebekah. Now, it's very interesting because of all of the patriarchs, only Isaac had one single wife, and that was Rebekah. And Rebekah really had a lot of power in the camp. And we know this because she has a lot of influence on Jacob. Now, the twins were quite different people. Esau was a hunter. He was kind of a man's man. He was strong. He was athletic. Jacob was not like that. Jacob was more of the philosopher. He was thoughtful. He hung out quite a bit with his mother. He knew how to cook. How do we know that he knew how to cook? E?
He made lentil bean stew.
That's right. He made lentil bean stew, and it smelled so good that his brother Esau gave away the birthright to have a bowl of it. Now, I know that our mothers make food just as good as that. In any case, we know that he spent a lot of time with his mother. Now, according to the Midrash, Jacob was supposed to be the firstborn, but Esau would not permit it. And so Jacob came out holding Esau's heel. And the word for heel is akev, and that is what gives us the name Yaakov. So Jacob grew up as the second son of Isaac. He was able to buy the birthright from his brother for a bowl of his lentil bean soup stew. But later on, he does something that's not very good. And it comes at his mother's urging. His father has decided to give the blessing. Now, the blessing is the inheritance. It's like the living will, where Isaac designates one of his children to be the next leader of the people, of the camp. And we know that there were quite a few people living in the camp because he inherited that from Abraham. And so Isaac is giving the blessing. And Rebekah tells Jacob to dress up like Esau. Esau is a hairy man, so Jacob puts on a suit made of sheepskin, which is also very hairy. However, when he goes in, Isaac, who is having problems with his eyesight, recognizes the voice of Jacob, but feels the arms of Esau. And he goes ahead and he gives Jacob the blessing. Now, once the blessing is given, it cannot be taken away. It's done. It's finished. And so rather than giving the blessing to Esau, which was which was Isaac's intention, he gives it to Jacob. Esau is furious and threatens to kill Jacob. So here is the first problem in Jacob's life. He is still young, but he has to run away. He has to leave home, or his brother is going to kill him. This is not a good situation, is it?
It is definitely not a good situation.
Very good. Absolutely not. And so he has to run away from home. Isaac and Rebekah facilitate this. They give him some food and they send him to Haran. Now they send him there because his uncle lives there, his uncle Lavan, Rebekah's brother, his mother's brother. And we know that Haran is important because Abraham lived in Haran for a short period of time, as did his nephew Lot, but then they left and went to Israel. However, when Rebekah came, she left family behind in Haran, particularly her brother Lavan and Lavan's two daughters, Leah and Rachel and Rachel. So Jacob goes to Haran and he meets his uncle and his two cousins. And lo and behold, what happens? He starts working for Lavan, who tries to cheat him. And he falls in love with
Lavan's daughter.
Which one?
His younger daughter, Rivka.
Rachel.
Rachel.
He falls deeply in love with Rachel, Lavan's younger daughter. And so he makes a deal with Lavan. He says, look, what do I have to do to marry Rachel? And Lavan says, you will need to work for me for 7 years for free to marry Rachel. And does he do it? He does. In fact, in the Torah, there's a beautiful sentence that says that he was so much in love with Rachel that working the 7 years seemed almost just like a day because he was so in love. And then comes the wedding day. Now, back in those days, they would cover the bride completely from head to toe so that you could not see the bride's face. That was the way of things. And so he gets married. They go into the tent and have the wedding night. And he wakes up in the morning. And guess what? Is it Rachel that he marries? It is not. It is the older daughter, Leah. But now he's married to her. Now, this is the time when Jacob is paid back, according to the Midrash, for what he did to his father. There is a concept in Jewish tradition in the Midrash called midah midah, which means measure for measure. What you do to someone else comes back to you. It's almost like karma. We hear a lot about karma in our society today. It's almost like karma. If you do something to someone, it's going to come back and hit you too. And so he deceived his father by dressing up as his brother. Lavan deceives Jacob by having Leah dress up as Rachel. So he goes to Lavan, and Lavan says, look, you know, in our tradition here in Haran, we don't allow the younger daughter to marry until the older daughter is married. And so I have given you the older daughter. Leah was not the favored wife, although, as we will see later on, she does run the household according to the Torah very well. She's quite organized. And she is responsible for most of the tribes of Jacob, for most of the children. Okay, so now Lavan makes another deal. When the week of the wedding is finished, because weddings last a week, we still do that today when we have Sheva Brachot, right? So weddings last a week. I will give you Rachel as your wife, but you will have to work for me for free for an extra 7 years. So going back to the context of how we're looking at Jacob, we understand that Jacob at this point has already had to run away from his brother who wants to kill him, has been deceived by his father-in-law and married the wrong woman. This is not a charmed life, is it? This is not somebody whose life goes perfectly all the time, is it? So already we see that Jacob confronts lots of difficulties. All right. In any case, Jacob eventually does marry Rachel. Unfortunately, Rachel dies young after the birth of her second child, Benjamin. Jacob is profoundly in sorrow. This wife that he worked for so long to get, whom he loved beyond any of his other wives, and he had 4 wives, beyond any of his other wives, dies early in childbirth. And it's very, very sad. He buries her by the road. They don't even have time to take her to the family burial site at Hebron at Machpelah. And so she is buried in a tomb by the road. In any case, as we go through the life of Jacob, we see that things were never easy for him. After the death of Rachel, he has all of these children. They are jealous of Rachel's eldest child, whose name is? Who's Rachel's eldest child?
Yosef?
Yosef, very good. You know, E, you are doing very well today. I am impressed. And so Yosef looks like Rachel, and therefore Jacob loves him over his other children and provides him with a special coat of many different colors. He makes him his heir. He does all of these things. His brothers get jealous. They end up thinking about killing him, but instead of killing him, they sell him into slavery and he goes down to Egypt. But what do they tell Jacob? They tell Jacob that his favorite son is dead. And so Jacob now has to live with the double sorrow of the death of his beloved wife and the supposed death of his most beloved son. What else happens to Jacob? Well, Jacob only has one daughter. Her name is Dinah. And Dinah is raped by the prince of a city that they are living near. In order to avenge that, Dinah's two brothers, Simon and Levi, go into the city and murder every single individual, every inhabitant of the city. Jacob and his camp need to leave before somebody comes to make war on them for having destroyed the city. We find that Reuben, the eldest son of Jacob, who was supposed to receive the inheritance, loses it because he has an inappropriate relationship with one of Jacob's wives. And so, as we can see, Jacob does not live a charmed life. Now, some of it is because of his decisions. Other times it's because of stuff that just happens to him. But does this sound like someone who is living a really good life with no problems, Eve?
No, it doesn't. He has a lot of problems.
He has a lot of problems. And finally, we get to the biggest problem of all, and that is, it is time for Jacob and his family now. Remember, he has a family. He's very wealthy. He has a lot of sheep. It is time for him to go home, to leave the area around Haran and to go back to Eretz Yisrael. And so, in order to do that, he has to go through the territory that is owned by whom?
Esav?
Esav. That's exactly right. The territory is called Edom, and it is owned by Esav, who in his own right is a very wealthy man. Now, the last time that Jacob saw Esav, Esav threatened to kill him. And so he hears from a messenger that Esav has gathered an army and is now on his way to intercept Jacob as Jacob comes into his territory. Jacob is scared to death, not only for his life, but for the life of his family. In fact, what he does is he divides his family into two different groups. One group will be in the front, that is Leah and her children. The other group of Benjamin, Rachel's child, and his family will be in the back, so that perhaps if Esau decides to attack, at least Benjamin and his family will survive. And so it is the night before he is to see Esau. and he's up all night. He does not sleep. And there appears to him an Ish, a man. Now, often this is referred to as an angel, but that's not clear in the Torah. The Torah doesn't necessarily say an angel. It's somebody representing God, perhaps. And he wrestles with the angel all night long. And finally, he defeats this man, this angel. And the angel said, "You have defeated me. I am changing your name. No longer will you be Yaakov, which we know means heel. You will be Yisrael, you and all your children," meaning he who wrestles with God and wins. Now, there's been a lot of commentary about this story. I tend to believe that while he's wrestling with the man, perhaps Jacob is wrestling with himself, with his conscience. Maybe he is thinking about his life, the things that he has done, the promises that God has made to him, but the problems that he has encountered, and what is coming for his future. Perhaps he wrestles with his own conscience, sort of like we do on Yom Kippur. Because for Jacob, this is sort of a Yom Kippur. It's a reckoning. It's a time of judgment. The next day, he meets with Esau, and rather than attacking him, Esau gives him a kiss. Now we are told by the Midrash that Esau actually bit him. But whatever it was, there was no battle. Esau brings him gifts. Jacob exchanges gifts with his brother. His brother goes peacefully back to his home in Edom, and Jacob is free to pass through with his family intact. It is really at that moment, during this wrestling episode, that we find the fulfillment of Jacob's life. In many ways, he is coming to terms with exactly what we've been talking about. That one can believe in God. That one can have faith in Hashem without necessarily living a charmed life. And that is Jacob's strength. You know, Abraham had his strength and Isaac had his strength. Persistence, resilience is Jacob's strength. And he is rewarded in the end when he goes to Egypt and finds that his son is not only alive, but is now the second to Pharaoh, one of the princes of Egypt, and is able to save Jacob and his family. And so in his declining years, Jacob has the joy of knowing that Joseph is alive and having a relationship with him, and also with Joseph's children, Ephraim and Manasseh. So in the end, Jacob finds peace. But it is a long time coming, and it only comes because he continues to have faith in Hashem. He is persistent, he is resilient, And even though he lives a life full of problems, he is an example to us of how we should live our lives. Because we all have problems, we all have difficulties, and we all sometimes suffer. Jacob reminds us that we must be persistent in our faith in Hashem and that we must be resilient to those things that might stop us from reaching our goals and living in peace. Thank you for listening once again. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. We podcast every Sunday. These are free. They are found on Facebook. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my assistant E, who is a wonderful, wonderful assistant, and it does a great job, and his family for letting him come and do this. Thank you, and have a good day, or evening, or night, depending on when you're listening.